Hey, this is John. Let's Talk Native is now on Patreon. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. We will be producing exclusive content for our Patreon supporters. Thanks for checking us out.
Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. We highlight the voices of Native activists, writers, poets, artists, thinkers, and musicians who are fighting for the rights of indigenous people all over Turtle Island. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. In this moment of historical change and social justice, our voices matter now more than ever before. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
So there you go. I'm John Kane, and I thank you for joining us. I have a guest in studio. With me is my grandson, Talon, and I asked him to join me because we've talked about education before. So we're going to talk a little bit more, and I'm going to ask firsthand what Talon's experience has been. He is you're a fifth grader?
Yes.
All right, and you're 10 years old?
Yes.
All right, got both those right again. I figured I'd ask him a series of questions, kind of what he has learned, and kind of go what they haven't learned. And so Talon will enlighten us a little bit, and maybe we'll all learn something about what school is teaching children, and maybe some of the things they need to do to correct it. And I do see improvement. So I do want to say, and this isn't a criticism of Talon's school or his teachers. It is, we talk about systemic problems, and when we talk about education, we know that there are systemic problems, and part of it is because of a legacy of how subjects are taught, and how historical figures are presented and not presented. So that's part of what we're trying to do here. So again, Talon, you are one of my 9 grandkids, and I want to thank you for taking the time and joining me here. Mm-hmm. I know you're kind of excited too, because you like this idea of being on YouTube, right? Yeah. Well, this is actually a podcast, so many people are going to hear the program, and some will watch the program. So, well, let me get right into it. One of the things that I asked you about were certain historical figures, but before we get there, what do they teach you when you guys cover the issue of Native people? And you said you guys haven't really addressed it this year, right?
No.
But in years past, any time that they've taught about Native people, have they always talked about Native people in the past, or do they talk about us as we live today?
Past.
So it's always been in the past.
Yeah.
So it's always about making dioramas of longhouses and that kind of thing. They talk about chiefs and clan mothers and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But they don't mention the fact that we're still here.
Not really.
Not really. So which is kind of my point. So and I've talked about this even as I've gone back to my old high school. I said, the problem with the way Native people are dealt with in history, we're dealt with as if we are just a period of time that we were there and now we're gone. So even today, in a time where schools and teachers are a little bit more aware of things, and especially living this close to the Seneca Nation, because you live in a town just north of here, just off. You don't live on the Native territory, but the school is obviously right next to Seneca Nation territory.
Yeah.
And yet they still seem to neglect that a Native territory is this close. Well, and I guess that kind of confirms that a little bit. One of the problems with history is if you only mention a people in one period of history, the assumption is that we don't exist through the rest of history, and that when I was a kid, the way they taught Indians was that we were the period that came before Columbus. And then somehow it goes from Indians to discovery to colonization, and then the colonies fight for independence. And where we fit into all of that stuff is never really talked about. So, which kind of brings me to the next subject, which is, what about historical figures like George Washington? What did they teach you or tell you about George Washington?
That he was like the father of the country and he was the first president.
Did they talk about him being a general?
No.
Really? So they don't even really address the role that he played in terms of not just being the first president of the United States, but they don't address his role in the Revolutionary War so much?
I've heard about him in the Revolutionary War.
But they never talk about his aggression towards Native people.
No.
Now, we live in Seneca territory, and some of the victims of much of George Washington's aggression were the Senecas. And in fact, the Senecas' territories would be raided by orders that came from George Washington to General Sullivan, where he wanted the Senecas to know the terror of their chastisement, which means that, how they would be punished, so to speak. But they never mentioned that in school, I suspect. No. Well, and this kind of gets to the point that when historical figures are spoken of, and they always tell the upside. They always tell the positive side. They don't necessarily say, yeah, but there were other parts of their character that may not have been as pleasant. Thomas Jefferson, for instance. What do you know about Thomas Jefferson?
That he was a president and he's on Mount Rushmore.
Right. Okay. Did they tell you that he was involved with the Louisiana Purchase? Are you familiar with that at all?
Maybe.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Now, did they ever tell you that he was a slaveholder?
No.
So they never mentioned that George Washington or Thomas Jefferson had slaves.
No.
No. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson, by many accounts, was a very well-established slaveholder. There have been recent revelations about how accurate he was with his accounting for slaves, and he knew just how little he could feed them and still make them productive to work his fields. And obviously that never gets mentioned.
No.
All right. Well, and the other thing that Thomas Jefferson, from a native standpoint, he was the president who was involved with purchasing what they called the Louisiana Purchase, which is, and they said that he purchased it from the French. Well, the French claimed title from the Spanish, and of course they all claimed title from native people. And what Thomas Jefferson's plan was to buy this land because then he could push all of the native people on the East Coast past west of the Mississippi. So in a way, it was Thomas Jefferson that would begin the process for the removal period of native people. And did you ever hear of the Trail of Tears? Are you familiar with that? See, they never even talked about the Trail of Tears.
Is it like a thing that goes across the map?
No. The Trail of Tears is when, during Andrew Jackson, another president, he's on, I think, what is he? Is he on the 20? Yeah, he's on the $20 bill. He's the president who forced the removal of native people to these other territories, or to other native territories, forced them west of the Mississippi. And in doing so, they called it the Trail of Tears because many people died on these forced marches. Sometimes as much as for the Cherokee, they said a third of the population died because they had to walk from Georgia in the southern states to Oklahoma. But the groundwork for all that was laid by Thomas Jefferson because that's the way he pitched the Louisiana Purchase to the southern states. He assured them that if they supported this purchase of this land title from the French, that would be a way to dispose of native people, just to push them over there. So, okay, let's another famous president, and you mentioned Mount Rushmore, Abraham Lincoln. Now, what were you taught about Abraham Lincoln?
He was one of the presidents, and
Speak up.
he was one of the presidents, and that's it.
What about freed the slaves?
Freed the slaves, yes.
Assassinated?
Assassinated, yes.
Okay, so those basic things. He was one of the presidents. He was tall, wore a funny hat. Yeah, they always teach you that. But what they don't teach you about his Emancipation Proclamation is that came only about a week after one of the largest executions, which was a public hanging of Native people that he signed the order for. So again, as they say all these great things about Washington or Jefferson or Lincoln, they leave out the parts that are not so nice. And let's be honest. I mean, we all have parts of our personality that are, we all think we're very nice people, right? We always think highly of ourselves.
Yeah.
But we also know that we can be jerks sometimes. But if we're only taught that these historical figures are only these heroes and that they never had any flaws in their character, that's not very accurate. And from a Native standpoint, we actually have a word for the President of the United States. In Mohawk, we say Ranadagayas, and it means town destroyer. And that comes from that Sullivan campaign that I talked about that George Washington ordered. So what we've learned is that each president has played a role in trying to do some, at some level, destroy our communities or some part of our lives. And so that word Ranadagayas didn't just get associated with George Washington. It would be a word that we would actually call all presidents. There was actually some confusion because some people thought that the word meant president, but it doesn't. It means town destroyer. We just applied that word or that name to the office of the U.S. presidency. So this is, again, you kind of confirm a little bit of what I've talked about a lot on this program, which is the need to teach more about who we are as Native people, not just who we were. Because that's part of the problem. Look, we just went through this election cycle, and I know they asked all you kids about who you wanted to vote for president, didn't they? Don't they sometimes do a mock election right in your classrooms? I know in the past they have.
They did that a few years ago for Trump, but I wasn't in school at the time because the school.
Oh, you heard about it? Okay.
Yeah, the school thought I had COVID.
Oh, you mean this year?
Yeah, this
year.
year.
That's right. You were out. Yeah, there was. Yeah, you're right. You guys had to quarantine for a little while, right? So you missed that. But that ends up being a conversation. Do they actually teach you about what each of these candidates represent, or do they just ask you which one you like?
Well, it's like a little paper you get to fill in the bubble.
So they don't even talk about what they represent. You just pick one. Yeah, so you're pretty much relying on what you either hear on TV, radio, or maybe what you hear at home, right?
At school, the one year when Trump was getting elected, everybody at school was yelling in my face, Trump, 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 Trump. Oh, it's fine.
Oh, so you actually felt the pressure. So when you were actually filling this out 4 years ago, you actually selected Trump.
Yes.
Do you feel guilty for that now? That's funny. But now I know that you guys were having a lot of debates about this year, and I know that some of your friends were very much Trumpers, and some of them were very much in the Biden camp.
I found 2 other people at school who like Biden.
Oh,
2
really?
other people. Everybody goes Trump, 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 Trump.
Well, and obviously you see flags all over the place.
Yeah.
Let me ask you another question, and I know you and I've talked about this. The Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Now, you were taught to say this in school, right?
Yes.
And do you remember when? Was it kindergarten?
Kindergarten's when I started, yeah.
Yeah, so in kindergarten, they taught you to pledge allegiance to the flag. Now, did you think you had to say it?
I thought I had to say it or else I'd get in trouble.
So you thought that if you didn't say it, they'd ask you they'd ask you to leave class?
Yeah.
And when did you learn you didn't have to say it?
Just a few months ago.
And who'd you learn that from?
Dad.
So your dad taught you that?
Yeah.
Well, I'm proud because I taught him that. So your dad told you that you don't have to say it. Now, did he tell you not to say it, or he said you don't have to say it?
He said I don't have to, but The reason he said that is because I was doing the announcements one day.
Oh,
And so
did you have to do the Pledge of Allegiance on the announcement?
I didn't have to do it because it cuts off when you go, I pledge allegiance to the flag, and then I just stop. I wouldn't say anything. I just look at. So all I would say, I pledge allegiance to the flag.
Okay,
But I didn't really mean it.
So, okay, now that you said that, do you know what the Pledge of Allegiance means?
Not really.
So, when they taught you those words to say, they never explained to you what any of that stuff meant?
No, I thought they just made us say it because it was catchy.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of catchy. Yeah, well, it's funny because it's really one of the first things that kids learn to repeat or to recite. The other one, when I was a little kid, they also taught you had to learn the words to the Star Spangled Banner. Did you guys have to do that one too?
Yeah.
So you had to remember those words.
I had to remember those words, and my whole class had to turn around from a screen that would say the words and do the lyrics and sing the song, and then they would just sing it.
Wow. And no, so this ends up being this was basically an assignment then to remember these things. Wow. So I mean, clearly they don't explain that you have options here. That if you don't necessarily subscribe to the notion of pledging allegiance to the flag, and and again, you have Native ancestry, and if you look at the history, we have a lot of good reasons for not wanting to pledge to the American flag and to the republic for which it stands. But the idea that this many years into you being asked to do this, if not required, but being asked to do this, nobody's taken the time to break it down, to explain what that really is. Because if you think about it, you're asking children to make a pledge. That's almost like asking you to sign a contract, which is obviously illegal, but or I don't know if it's illegal, but it's not right anyway. But the idea that schools feel like it's appropriate to ask children to recite something and make a public pledge in front of there's even the whole one nation under God thing, which not everybody believes in. In fact, you just learned that in school too, right?
Well, I haven't believed in God for a while.
But you always assumed everybody else did, and that perhaps you were different than everybody because you didn't have the same beliefs that they did. Mm-hmm. And now you just were telling me earlier that you learned that some other people said, no, I don't really believe that stuff either.
Yeah, I was talking to my lunch lady there.
Oh, I won't get you in trouble. But but no. So I mean, because that's part of the Pledge of Allegiance. When they first wrote that wasn't in there. They added it later because I think people felt like it needed to have that in there, I guess. But it's interesting that you're 10 years old. For 5 years, you have had some level of, if not direction or encouragement, what you thought was a requirement to say something that they never thought to explain to you what it is. Because the thing is, I know that the United States looked at other countries who would have programs to indoctrinate their children to a certain belief system. They'd always condemn it. The most familiar example is Nazi Germany. They would say, "Oh, look at what they do to those children. They make those children say this. They make these children salute. They make these children do." I'm thinking, but you do the same thing, and essentially that's what they've done with the Pledge of Allegiance.
Yeah.
Now, when you learned that you didn't have to say it anymore because your dad let you know that, did it become a conversation in school?
Well, the first time I did it, my teacher called me over there, and she's like, "Hey, how come you didn't do the pledge?" And I said, "Well, because just lately, I figured I don't have to do it because I don't have those beliefs."
And he was your teacher. Was it a woman or a man?
Woman.
And she was okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay, but she did feel like she had to ask you though. She had to in a way, she had to call you out on it.
Yeah, I don't remember if it was in person school or on the computer.
Oh, okay, all right. But it just goes to show you that it's that recent. It's been since a lot of this COVID outbreak, and of course you're spending more time at home. So I think the whole idea of being around your parents more. This may have encouraged, some of these conversations even at home, I would suspect. All right, the last one I got to ask you about, and especially since it's that time of year, is Thanksgiving. Now, have you all? How have they approached teaching you about Thanksgiving in school?
Other years, they've just talked about pilgrims and stuff like that.
Pilgrims and Indians.
Pilgrims and, yeah.
So happy little pilgrims and happy little Indians
Yeah.
having dinner together.
Yeah.
And is that the way they have kind of expressed the first Thanksgiving, that it was just this celebration between two different cultures? Is that the way they kind of approached it?
Yeah.
And did you guys do like little paper cutouts, a little pilgrim and little Indian
Yes.
cutouts, and construction paper and all that stuff? Did you make headdresses and turkeys and pilgrim hats? And yeah, that's what I thought. Now, you're getting older, so now teachers, because they're most of the time the schools view this as some level of age appropriateness on what other parts of the story they can tell. Now, is it true that your teacher now are saying that that's not necessarily the approach that she wants to take to talking about Thanksgiving?
Yes. She told me that that's not the way she will teach it.
Really? So she's actually made a commitment to you that the whole happy little pilgrims, happy little Indians thing is not necessarily the way she's going to approach Thanksgiving in the way that she teaches.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, for the record, the first documented or declared Thanksgiving by the colonists was not about happy little pilgrims and happy little Indians. It was about bloodshed. It was about the pilgrims, the non-native or the non-native colonies, basically waging a war against the Wampanoag, where they killed, slaughtered many native people, men, women, and children. And in fact, the one that they regarded as the leader, they decapitated him, they stuck his head on a pole, and they put it at the edge of town. And then they made an announcement that they proclaimed this day to be a national day, or their Thanksgiving, a Thanksgiving celebration of their conquest of the Wampanoag. Not at all the way that's ever been taught to you in school.
No, I've never heard of that before.
You never heard that story before. Well, but it's interesting because you did say your teacher asked you if you celebrated Thanksgiving, and when you said you just eat, she wondered if you did because of your native background, right?
Yes.
So she literally said, "Well, I wasn't sure because you're native."
Yeah.
Something along those lines. Well, it's interesting that and I'm proud that you do have teachers that are willing to acknowledge that. And it is interesting that you have teachers that are now getting to that place where they're willing to rethink how they address some of these issues, because the problem is that these things have been misrepresented for a long time. Now, Thanksgiving as a holiday was only declared a national holiday, for 150 years ago or so. I think Abraham Lincoln was the first president to declare it. So it wasn't always a holiday. But from a native standpoint, we actually have at minimum 13 Thanksgivings that are part of our culture, 4 major ones, and they're scattered out throughout the year. The Thanksgiving that we would give during this time of year, the harvest Thanksgiving, is something that actually many cultures have had this kind of thing, especially after they take in all of their crops and that kind of stuff, and they've got their food prepared for the winter. They give an acknowledgement. The difference is, Native people are not necessarily thanking God. They are thanking the earth for providing, helping them to provide them for themselves, and they're thanking each other. It's an acknowledgement. It's a celebration to celebrate each other, and but it's not necessarily a religious holiday. And of course, in the United States, it's not really considered a religious holiday. But a lot of people, kind of turn it into that, and they believe that if in order to give thanks, there's only one thing to thank, and that's to thank God. And yet there's a lot in the world that we need to be thankful for, and it's not just enough to be thankful. We need to be responsible. We need to do more all that we can to give something back to the earth that provides us. That's what the native kind of view of Thanksgivings are in all of them, throughout the year. So whether we're celebrating the maple sugar, or planting, or strawberries, or green corn, or harvest, or midwinters, or any of these, these periods of throughout the year that we have these these ceremonies or these festivals, they are all essentially Thanksgivings, and we're just thanking what the earth is providing at that time of the year. So, well, it's again, I think it's great that you wanted to come join me. I know that are you excited? Are some of your classmates and your teachers probably going to check out your appearance here?
Yeah, I did tell some of my friends. Some of them said my mom's probably not going to let me watch it, but
Well, I think this is pretty safe programming. I think everybody should feel pretty comfortable. But
I looked it up on my school computer, and it says this. I went on YouTube, tried to get to one of your videos, and it said this video is not good for your computer.
oh, but that's usually has more to do only because they don't have what do they call it? It might not be virus protected or something like that. But if you got it from YouTube, it's YouTube's probably pretty safe. So most computers will not flag any kind of YouTube video as unsafe for your computer. So, but anyway, we don't need to belabor that point. But no, I think it's great that you joined me. I'm hoping that that your classmates and your teachers will maybe take something away from this, and maybe in a couple of years we'll bring you back and we'll see if anything's changed in the way they're teaching you some of these subjects.
Okay.
Well, I want to thank you. I want to thank you so much for joining me. My grandson, Talon Kane, and again, I want to thank him for giving us some of his time and sharing some of his insight on what it's like to be taught only kind of one side of the historical equation, so to speak. So. All right. Thank you very much for joining me. All right. Oh, you don't. We're gonna take a break, and then we can usher you off stage here during our break time. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native with my grandson. We'll be right back in a few minutes. Thanks. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. I want to thank again my grandson Talon for joining me for the first half of the program. It's kind of enlightening, and I talk a lot about on the show about what I assume takes place in school. So to be able to talk to a 10-year-old about his experience in everything from the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag to what they're taught in history or about things like Thanksgiving, it is insightful. And as I've mentioned a few times on the last couple of shows, I did go out to my old high school, and it's kind of like taking a step in time to go back to the school that you graduated from back in 1978. It's really strange. Not only do I get a chance to see some friends that I haven't seen in a long time, but just to revisit the issue, like the mascot issue. And I've gotten a lot of feedback from that. Not only do I have a change.org petition out there that's close to 1,000 signatures on it. But I know the superintendent at Cambridge has been getting a bunch of letters from different people. I've had classmates, some of my classmates who've gone on to be various professionals in various areas, including medicine, and one of my friends is a professor, history professor. Some folks that are involved in the activist community have stepped up. My friend Chuck Rinaldi here, who was a former superintendent at Gowanda, submitted a letter. And I'm glad to get that kind of feedback, because I think it is really difficult. And we've seen this in other towns like Lancaster, where you have a population that is is undiverse a word? They're not very diverse, very, very white. I think Lancaster was like 98% white by race. Cambridge is over 97. So, you know that you don't have a lot of diversity within the town, and you also don't see a lot of people who leave and come back. So if you leave and and all of a sudden you realize that there's a much bigger world out there, and you don't bring any of that awareness back to your hometown, the town kind of stays the same. And when I spoke at the board meeting last week, it was interesting because there was this a certain part of the community that did leave and came back, or people who didn't necessarily grow up there but live there now, and can acknowledge the inappropriateness of a native or race-based mascot. But you also end up with people who get entrenched in the way that they've always been taught, which is part of the reason I wanted to do the first part of this show the way I did. But you have people that basically peak in high school, and it's like the best part of their lives was playing on the football team or the basketball team, or or lacrosse team, or whatever it is that you did. Or perhaps there was some other aspect, whether it was band or theater or whatever, whatever part of your high school experience made it memorable. Many times people can rely on that as the best times of the year, of their best times of their life, which isn't a terrible thing. I mean, it's not a terrible thing to have enjoyed your high school. It is, a little bit, sad that you don't have as much to shape your identity after that, especially if you're 40 or 50 or 60 or older. If you're still clinging on to your high school memories, that's probably not real healthy, from a mental health standpoint. And if the only way that you can cling on to that is to cling on to the mascot, and I've talked about this before, I think only the use of native people as mascots, whatever the word is, whether it's Indians, Redskins, Red Raiders, whatever it is, I think this might be a bit of an exception, because I never heard people talk about being a Panther 50 years old, or an eagle, or a cougar. Well, maybe cougars, but that's a whole nother issue. But I've never seen people hang on to an identity the way, especially non-native people, will cling on to being an Indian or a Redskin. And you see that, even with pro sports and that kind of stuff. It's like that identity, like they try to become that thing, and that thing is not, it's not accurate. It's a stereotype. And oftentimes it's not even an accurate stereotype, if there is such a thing as an accurate stereotype. These are inventions. So this is part of the challenge. And when you have a school that has for decades, or maybe even the better part of a century, called themselves Indians, you would think that school would commit themselves to teaching about that subject a little bit. I mean, you're teaching your kids to emulate, an image, a logo, a profile, or whatever, a caricature, but you're not giving the time to teach about, well, who are the native people that were from there? I mean, and that area that I'm talking about, which is, Cambridge, New York, that essentially was Mohawk territory. We can argue whether it was Mohican or Mohawk or whatever, but clearly the names of many of the towns and the rivers around there are Mohawk words. Sacandaga, Schenectady. These are words that are, usually somewhat bastardized, but they're words that come from the Mohawk language, Adirondack. These are words that are a part of our culture, and yet even in this school, they don't even teach where the words come from. The names of the rivers, Walloomsac. I mean, none of these, all these words and all these names and rivers and streets and even little towns, they never make the connection. So when you take on this made up identity, this made up imagery of some sort of native reference, and call that, and then you want to claim it. And I listen to white people and a few native people from Cambridge say, well, I'm a Cambridge Indian. Really? I thought you were Onondaga. Oh, really? I thought you were Oneida. And then you see a white guy stand up and say, well, I'm a Cambridge Indian till the day I die. I'm thinking, really? That's at 67 years old? you're still clinging to that as your identity. And shame on you if you are Native, if you are more drawn to a mascot as your identity than your then whatever connection or lack of connection you have to your ancestry, you have all that available to you. Look, if you're Onondaga, you can learn about being Onondaga. If you're Oneida, you can learn about being Oneida. Or Mohawk, you might even learn that those words have been bastardized. Ganyagahaga, Onyotaaga, Onundaaga. I mean, these are, we could learn some of these things and take something of value from that. But to reduce yourself to a misnomer like Indians and to claim that that's what you are, I mean, regardless of whether you're white or not white, just the idea that this is what some people settle into and then can be pretty aggressive about defending it. Trust me, going out to my old high school, even though I went to school there from third grade until I graduated, you know, I was clearly treated as an outsider coming in there to take something away from that community. And I was glad that I had a fair amount of support from other voices there. Some people who are more socially conscious, people who know that when they've worn their Cambridge Indian swag to another region, people say, "Really? You guys still use those?" You know, and you think that's appropriate? So there are students that have left Cambridge that were embarrassed because they didn't know. They didn't know that it was inappropriate. Why? And of course, how would they know? When you've got an entire school that is promoting this thing and encouraging this kind of thing, it's you end up, for all intents and purposes, you end up damaging students. And that's really the point, because it doesn't matter if I'm offended. I mean, I don't live there, right? And I don't live there, and I don't have to deal with Cambridge Indians on a daily basis. And it really doesn't matter if you're 65 years old and you still are clinging to this idea of being a Cambridge Indian, because it's not about you either. What it's about is the kids. And that's why I was grateful to have my grandson join me here. It's important that our children have a deeper understanding about the world around them. And some of that starts with the way history is taught. But it's also, look, in school, they don't call it history anymore specifically. They call it social studies, or they call it global studies. Well, how do you teach about global studies and then have this narrow view about stereotyping, or this narrow view about appropriating somebody else's culture for yourselves? And again, Native people are very, it's a very singular practice to grab Native culture. You don't see any other cultures. You used to see a little of it. I mean, honestly, you used to see a little of it. There used to be, I remember, it's like what's that organization? They call them the Shriners, right? I mean, there's these organizations that had like this Middle East connection, but that become unfashionable. So they ditched it all. I mean, they used to, some teams call themselves Crusaders, which is really tied to this idea of, promoting Christianity via the sword. Most of that stuff's gone, away. People always bring up, the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Well, their mascot's a leprechaun. I mean, they're not real. So that's something a little different. But Native people, there are still probably close to 2,000 schools in the United States that rely on Native imagery, some reference, if not a word. And look, it can range from everything from Redskins to Red Raiders to warriors, savages, Indians, or the individual names: Mohawks, Oneidas, Navajo, Sioux, Fighting Sioux. I mean, Florida State Seminoles. So they use Native peoples, and oftentimes the words that they're using to the names of the tribes are inappropriate. I mean, like I said, the word Indians. Seneca Nation's dropping the word Indians from their name. They're not. They used to be for years called the Seneca Nation of Indians. Now they're pretty much taking that away. In fact, they've moved not only away from Seneca Nation of Indians to Seneca Nation, but they're actually moving more towards Onondaga, their own word for who they are. The big debate that's gone out west is for the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota is the use of the word Sioux, because that's an inappropriate name. That word isn't what they call themselves. It's what others call themselves. And that's the same thing that goes for Gunjagahaga, or what most people know as Mohawks. By some, breakdown of the etymology of that word, it was meant to, to suggest some sort of cannibalism, or eaters of flesh. And it's not what we called ourselves. And this is the part that's so twisted about it. When a dominant culture coins these phrases or expressions, they end up sticking. So we end up using words like Indians or tribes. And again, I talked about it a great deal on the show. The word tribe is not a compliment. And you only have to listen to how the talking heads on the news use words like tribe, tribalism, or any of that stuff, or tribal. When they talk about the tribal regions of Afghanistan, they aren't talking about the civilized, sophisticated parts of Afghanistan. So when words like that, we begin to use them ourselves, and it's worse than that, because it's not only the words that we use. I've talked about this on the show before. There have been periods of our history, and of, I guess if we were to call our own part of our history the Reconstruction period, where we started reconstructing our past by learning more about it. We were wearing Plains Indian headdresses for a while. Why? Because that's the way we were depicted on the movies. It didn't make any sense. We weren't wearing Gustoas. I've seen pictures of native people in the 50s and the 60s, Haudenosaunee, Mohawks, Onondagas, wearing these long headdresses. It doesn't make any sense. But it kind of shows you what a dominant culture does when it beats you down in terms of how they are defining you. Pretty soon you're calling yourselves what they call you. And even words like redskin. Part of the reason that there still are some native people who were okay with that word was because, frankly, there was so very little in the dominant society around us that the people could cling to or have any identity to. They jumped at the opportunity to wear a Cleveland Indians hat with that stupid cartoon image on the front of it, or and frankly, I can't stand the Blackhawks jersey either. This strange smile on the side of profile, but we cling to that stuff. The Atlanta Braves, the Washington Redskins, and for my age group, as we got older, we said, that's really not appropriate, especially when they start parading either native people. And yes, they did this with native people, or white people dressed up as native people to do the dance on their football field or their basketball court or something like that. That seemed like a real mockery. And even when they brought in native people to do it, it seemed like a sellout. It seemed, it was something that really struck a bad note. So, we have an opportunity in this age of information to learn so much more. And again, we've learned a lot more. We've used technology to reinvigorate our language and our language programs. We know what to call ourselves. We don't call ourselves Indians. We call ourselves Ongwe. We don't call ourselves Iroquois. We call ourselves Haudenosaunee or Haudenosaunee. We don't call ourselves any of these words that have been pinned upon us. Tribes, tribal organizations. You've heard me talk about my concern about people referring to themselves as enrolled members or even citizens of a Mohawk nation, if you will. No, it's just enough to say that you're Gunjagahaga, or enough to say that you're Seneca. You don't have to reduce yourself to a member of an organization, because in all of our the translations of our words, so when we say Gunjagahaga, it's the people of the land of Flint. It's the people of the land of the mountains, Onondaga, what people know as Senecas. It's the people of the land where the stones stand up, Onyotaaga, what you know as Oneida. It's always the people. It's not the nation. It's not the citizens. All of those words, they have some political connotation to them. So when people ask me, well, how do you describe yourself? How do you feel about Native American? Don't like it. How do you feel about American Indian? Really don't like it. I'll use the word native singularly because it's a benign word. It doesn't have as much, political connotation to it. But I would rather use a word in my language, but I realize that even when I tell somebody that I'm Gunyagahaga, I know that I got to explain it. I got to say, well, you know it is Mohawk. Someday we don't have to do that anymore. And so we look at this period of time as a transition. It's a transitional time for not only us to shed away some of those colonial influences, but almost to re-indoctrinate ourselves to our own culture. And in doing so, we share that with other people. So I think that's what's so important about the times that we're living in. And look, I know we can always look at where we're at and think things are terrible. From a Native standpoint, we've had worse. We've had worse times. And now, and it gets me to this whole idea when I hear people say, well, we just need to be peaceful and prayerful people. Well, I'm sorry. It never worked. And, this idea of being peaceful and prayerful, I'm not saying, armed resistance has worked out great either, but at least by resisting, by putting up resistance, we set an example to our kids and to our grandkids that, look, there's something worth fighting for. And that fight may not be, knockdown dragouts in the street, but it might be a debate. It might be a conversation. It may be standing up against a pipeline. It might be standing up against, a mascot. It might be, or whatever it is. It may be standing up for our people, protecting our children, the missing and murdered indigenous women issue, whatever that is. There's a reason for standing up. And no, it's not about being weak. And when I hear people say, "Oh, you're just too sensitive," no, I'm not. I'm not too sensitive. It's not about being offended. It's about feeling empowered to stand up to some of this stuff. So whether I'm going to my old high school, or whether I'm dealing with something in the city of Buffalo or in Washington D.C. or Albany, I'm not protesting out of weakness. I'm empowered, and I want each of our generations to be empowered. Look, I do want to spend a few minutes also talking about where we're at right now with the pandemic. And, I think it's easy for us to always view it as something that's not quite affecting us. Of course, if you've lost a loved one or if somebody close to you has been sick, you understand the seriousness of it. Unfortunately, I've listened to some people who, as they hear, even as they've seen people get sick, they see the president of the United States, well, he survived it. It must not be that big a deal. I've listened to, to governors, including the New York State governor, address this thing. And look, some people will praise him. Some people will condemn him. I don't have, a great feeling towards Andrew Cuomo. But when he was kind of calling out Western New York, this area around us here, especially Erie County, for having the worst numbers, I listened to some other people on the right, take such offense to it. And look, I hate to say it, but even how we deal with this COVID-19 pandemic, the lines separate right along political lines. If you're a Trump follower, if you are somebody on the right, there's a good chance that you don't think very strongly about wearing a mask. And, I listened to one of these Western New York politicians say, well, every time I go someplace, I see people practicing safe distance and wearing a mask. It's funny because every place I go, I see somebody dropping that mask below their nose. And, if you wear a mask below your nose, you might just as well not be wearing it. Because we breathe through our nose. If you breathe through your mouth, you got some other issues going on. If you have to breathe through your mouth because you can't breathe through your nose, you probably should be staying home anyway because you probably have some sort of underlying condition. So, and I'm not even getting into the whole mouth breather, derogatory expressions or whatever. I'm not even going there. But if you wear that mask below your nose, you are exhaling droplets of whatever is in your lungs. Whether you're positive or negative, that's what you're doing. And so you're exposing yourself. So when I hear people, especially the people on the right who want to claim, well, we're right to life believers. We abhor abortion. But you don't think you should wear a mask to protect life? And it's not about, look, whatever risk you place on yourself, I have no sympathy. And I mean this. I know some people say, "Oh, I wouldn't wish this upon anybody." Well, I wish I could say that. No, I don't wish I could say that. There's some people I wish would get sick, because the amount of pain and suffering some people have caused other people is, it deserves some payback. I'm just going to say it. But if you are not practicing any of the safe practices and you get sick, I have no sympathy for you. But the problem is, it isn't about you. It's about who you get sick. It's about taking it home to your loved ones, to your parents, your grandparents, or your children, or people that you may not feel very strongly. Maybe it's your neighbor or whoever. That's the problem. And the fact that this cuts along political lines, it just kind of shows you the level of ignorance and the level of influence that a guy like Donald Trump has on people's common sense. I mean, I'll never understand how it is that 73 million, 9 million more this time than last time, voted for that moron that sits in the White House still. I don't have any idea how that happens. But the fact that so many people do support him and then want to be dismissive about something that is really, really deadly. I mean, look, the numbers are clear. Today, or actually, yes, let me think. Which days are we on here? By last night and by tonight, the likelihood is there may be 200,000 new cases for yesterday and today. Clearly, they've already reached that peak of over 2,000 deaths in a single day. And it might go down on Sunday and Monday as all of the reporting, kind of gets underreported during those days. But this is getting worse. And I hear people complaining that their pool hall is shut down, or that that they can't eat in a restaurant. This thing could have been nipped in the bud early on if people had really locked down. But what Americans view as their freedom can be so detrimental to the freedom of other people. They don't ever consider the fact that when you talk about freedom, it can't come at the expense of other people. Otherwise, it's not freedom. It's abuse. It's neglect. It's irresponsibility. So I just feel like I've got to say this, because it is getting so bad, and I think we do need to be concerned. I know there's people that are pissing and moaning about celebrating Thanksgiving next week. Well, how the hell can you gather families and even extended families together, knowing that the whole purpose is supposed to give thanks when what you might be giving is infection? I mean, this is not rocket science. This is just common sense. If people stop pissing and moaning about some of this stuff and be responsible, we'd stop seeing the spread. If you're sick, especially if you feel any symptoms, even something that might be remotely associated with COVID-19, then stay home, for crying out loud. You've got no reason. Look, in the beginning, in the spring when this was being addressed, you would never see anybody in a store with a bunch of kids in tow. We didn't bring our kids. And I'm going to tell you, you can't go to a store and not see, an elderly couple in a Walmart, or some parent with their kids tucked into their shopping cart. Man, we got to figure out better ways of doing this, so we aren't exposing elderly and children and dragging them around into public spaces where you're not going to have social distancing. And I got to say this again too. All the masks do are prevent droplets. They do not prevent the aerosolized virus. Those viruses are small. They can actually penetrate a mask. The only thing the mask can stop are droplets. So while it may be true that many of these droplets are what's carrying some of it, it's been established and well established that some of this stuff is aerosolized. So it's airborne. Beyond the moist droplets coming from your breath, it's aerosolized. So look, we just have to be more responsible. And so consider this last part of the program my public service announcement. But it's really just a plea for people to have a little more common sense and do the right thing. you don't have to celebrate every traditional holiday in times that are anything but regular. And even as a native, from a native standpoint, I'm sure there have been many times that we didn't celebrate a midwinters because of a plague or a war or some sort of pestilence. So it's time for us to to be more responsible. That's my ask. I want to thank you for listening, and again, I want to thank my grandson for having joined me today. We'll see you next time. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.